Let me ask you something. When you're completely alone, no audience, no agenda, no one to impress or perform for, what do you actually do? Most people, if they're honest, reach for the phone, scroll, watch something, fill the silence quickly, efficiently, before it gets uncomfortable. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a specific subset of people who, when left entirely to themselves, do something different, something quieter, something that, from the outside, might look like nothing at all, but is actually one of the most cognitively sophisticated things a human mind can do. And here's the part that surprises people. These behaviors aren't habits the people who have them chose deliberately. They didn't read a self-improvement article and decide to become this way. The behaviors emerged on their own, organically, because the mind doing them needed them. They're symptoms, in the best sense of that word, outward signs of an inner architecture that processes the world at a deeper level than average. Today, we're talking about 7 things you might do alone that signal a genuinely rare form of intelligence. Not the kind measured on tests, but the kind that shows up in how you think, feel, and make meaning when no one is watching. The first one is something a lot of people feel slightly embarrassed about. You have full, detailed conversations with yourself, not muttering, not self-talk in the pep talk sense. Full internal dialogues, sometimes spoken out loud, alone in the car or the shower, where you play multiple roles, argue different positions, work through how something went or how something might go. You're the defendant and the prosecutor and the judge, and the case is usually something that happened last Thursday. Here's what's actually happening. When you do this, your brain is engaging what cognitive scientists call internal simulation, the mind's ability to model scenarios, run alternatives, and test outcomes without any external input. This is a function of the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network, the part of the brain that becomes active during self-reflection and imaginative thinking. Research by psychologist Mary Helen Imardino-Young at USC has shown that this kind of deep internal processing is strongly correlated with moral reasoning, empathy, and the capacity for meaning making. In other words, the conversation you're having with yourself in the car is not weird. It's your brain running sophisticated simulations that most minds don't engage with nearly as deeply. The second thing is that you re-examine your own opinions regularly, without anyone prompting you. You might be doing something completely unrelated, folding laundry, walking, waiting, and a thought surfaces. Wait, do I actually believe that? And then you follow the thread. Not because someone challenged you, not because you read something that contradicted you, just because your brain, left to its own devices, circles back and audits its own conclusions. This is called epistemic humility in practice, and it's rarer than it sounds. Most people, once they've settled into a belief or an opinion, don't voluntarily revisit it. The psychological term for this tendency is belief perseverance, the almost universal human tendency to maintain positions even in the face of contradicting evidence. The people who spontaneously re-examine their own thinking, alone, unprompted, are exercising a metacognitive skill, thinking about their own thinking, that is genuinely associated with higher order reasoning. Robert Kegan, the developmental psychologist at Harvard, spent decades researching adult cognitive development and found that the capacity to hold your own beliefs as objects of examination, rather than simply living inside them, represents one of the rarest and most sophisticated forms of intellectual maturity. Third, you find deep, genuine pleasure in learning things that have absolutely no practical application. Not to impress anyone, not to use at a dinner party. You fell into a 3-hour research dive about the migratory patterns of a bird you'll never see, or the engineering of a medieval siege weapon, or the etymology of a word you accidentally looked up at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. And it was genuinely one of the better parts of the week. Psychologists call this intrinsic motivation the pursuit of knowledge for its own reward, independent of any external outcome. Research by Desai and Ryan on self-determination theory consistently shows that intrinsic motivation is not only more sustainable than extrinsic motivation, but is also associated with deeper processing, better retention, and more creative thinking. What's happening in your brain during a genuine curiosity spiral is that dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with the reward and motivation, is being released not because you found an answer, but because the search itself is pleasurable. Your brain is wired to find the process of discovery rewarding. That is not a common wiring. It's an unusual one that correlates strongly with lifelong learning, creative problem solving, and intellectual flexibility. The fourth thing is that you process experiences through narrative. After something happens, a difficult conversation, a surprising moment, an ordinary day, you find yourself retelling it to yourself. Not just recalling facts, but building a story. What it meant, how it fits, what it says about the larger pattern of your life. You are, without realizing it, a constant narrator of your own existence. Jerome Bruner, one of the founding figures of cognitive psychology, argued that narrative is not just how humans communicate, it's how human beings make sense of their experience at a fundamental level. He called this narrative mode thinking and distinguished it from paradigmatic or logical thinking. Both are forms of intelligence, but narrative thinking is the deeper form of self-understanding, the way we integrate experience into identity. People who do this spontaneously and richly, alone, are engaging one of the most ancient and sophisticated cognitive functions available to us. You're not dwelling, you're constructing meaning. There's a difference, and it matters enormously. Fifth, and this is the one that gets people, you notice things nobody mentioned. You're walking through a space, or sitting in a meeting, or reading a book, and something catches in you. A detail, an inconsistency, a connection between two things nobody has put together yet. And you don't always say it, you hold it. You let it develop. Later, often much later, it turns out to be something. This is what psychologists call incubation, the phase of creative and analytical processing that happens below conscious awareness. Research on insight problem solving, particularly the work of Mark Jung-Beeman and John Cunios, has shown using fMRI and EEG imaging that the brain actively continues processing problems during periods of apparent rest. The insight, the aha moment, arrives when a right hemisphere associative connection breaks through into conscious awareness. People who notice things and hold them without forcing resolution are neurologically creating the conditions for these deeper integrations to happen. You are not spacing out. You are incubating. Sixth, you are drawn to complexity. When everyone else in the conversation is looking for the simple answer, part of you is already uncomfortable with it. Not because you enjoy being difficult, but because you can feel the places where the simple answer doesn't quite hold. You're naturally drawn to ambiguity, nuance, the places where two true things seem to contradict each other. You find those places interesting rather than threatening. This is a cognitive trait called tolerance for ambiguity, and it's one of the strongest predictors of creative and integrative intelligence. Psychologist Elsa Frankel-Brunswick first identified this trait in the 1940s, and decades of subsequent research have confirmed the correlation. People with high tolerance for ambiguity generate more original ideas, make better decisions under uncertainty, and are more capable of holding complexity without collapsing it prematurely into false simplicity. The discomfort you feel when someone oversimplifies something isn't pedantry. It's your mind accurately perceiving that something real is being lost in the reduction. And the seventh thing, the one that quietly underlies all the others, is that you genuinely enjoy your own company, not as a coping mechanism, not as an avoidance strategy, but as a preference. You have learned over time and through honest experience that the interior life is interesting, that the mind, given space and silence, will go somewhere worth going. You don't dread being alone. You find it often to be where the best thinking happens. Research consistently shows that solitude, voluntarily chosen, unforced solitude, is associated with creativity, self-knowledge, emotional regulation, and intellectual depth. Esther Buchholz, the psychologist who wrote extensively about what she called the life of the mind in solitude, argued that our culture has severely undervalued the alone state, treating it as absence rather than presence, as loneliness rather than chosen depth. The people who seek solitude, who use it well, who emerge from it with more clarity than they went in with, these are not people who can't connect. They are people whose minds have simply learned that some of the most important work happens in quiet. Here's what I want to say about all of this. None of these 7 behaviors is better than their alternatives. Having detailed conversations with yourself doesn't make you superior to someone who doesn't. Enjoying solitude doesn't make you more evolved than someone who finds energy in company. But if you recognize yourself in several of these, if you felt reading them, that quiet sense of, oh, so that's what that is, then you're getting a small piece of useful self-knowledge. These are the behaviors of a mind that processes deeply. A mind that is genuinely, probably without knowing it, doing some of its most sophisticated work precisely when it's most alone. That's worth knowing. That's worth sitting with. And if you want to talk about it, if one of these landed in a way you want to put words to, I'd genuinely love to hear it in the comments. And if this kind of exploration of how uncommon minds work is something you want more of, stick around. There's always more to go into.